So today we have Apsana Begum MP with us. Who's very kindly agreed to come and speak about housing, I think, and a subject that she wrote an article recently for Labour Outlook, and I'll put the link in the chat. But in the meantime, I'll hand over to Apsana. It's all yours. Would you like to unmute yourself, Tessa?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me during your lunch hour. And it's a pleasure to be able to join you all as momentum activists, as activists in the Labour Party, and activists who are trying to sort of bring about changes in housing, and in particular housing legislation as well, of which I'm incredibly passionate about, particularly because I'm in a constituency which has incredible challenges around housing. And as has been mentioned, I mean, I did write an article recently on housing because there have been a number of pieces of legislation that have been brought forward by government which seeks to deregulate the housing sector even further, and puts all of us, I think, in a very difficult situation in terms of ensuring that every single person in our country has their rights and their needs to have a safe and decent home be challenged and be made much more difficult to achieve. And I want to sort of start by talking about the government's their very own research that was published earlier this year, and this was just in July. And one of the recent pieces of legislation that's been brought is one around permitted development rights. And their own research in July actually demonstrated and evidenced how it leads to lower quality development, and how it leads to how it will eventually lead to impacts on overcrowding and space. And this is a government that's now producing and putting forward this legislation, knowing that these are the exact sort of areas in which it needs to be doing much more on. And in terms of just permitted developments on its own, I mean, their own reports suggested that just around 22% of units created in that way would meet their own nationally described space standards. So it goes to show exactly how smaller pieces of legislation are also influencing the planning and housing landscape. And we know, for example, that through permitted developments, for example, we're losing a great number of affordable homes that could have been built, and scrapping those rules, scrapping those laws. It means that local people have much less say on new developments in their area. And when I look at our housing landscape, I think what's really important to acknowledge is how much local voices have been left out and have been written out of the legislation in terms of decisions that have obviously such a huge impact on local people. And so you're removing that requirement, I guess, of planning permission. In the case of permitted developments, for example, removes, I think, the requirement for more affordable homes. And obviously this couldn't be happening at a worse time than in a pandemic as well. And it's no surprise then why we look at the government's planning reforms overall, and it's been aptly described as a developer's charter. It is essentially favouring developers at the expense of local voices and local people. And when we look at Section 106, for example, there are limits in terms of, or requirements for developers to ensure that there is a direct link between what they build and then what they contribute towards affordable housing. And these this developers charter, as is commonly sort of used to describe these series of reforms, is actually leading to the watering down of what is already the limited requirements for developers to contribute to building affordable housing. And I want to sort of touch on, what some of the other organisations have said, and no doubt some of you will be aware. But Shelter, is a housing and homelessness charity. They're also pointing out that the majority of social homes that are being built are being done under these requirements, and talking about the fact that we obviously need, there is a desperate need to build more social homes. But that real pitiful trickle that is being built is now also put at risk. So the government may call it sort of red tape, but housing experts and housing charities and housing organisations, quite rightly so, recognise that there are important protections that are needing to be put against sort of unsafe and low quality housing that is now being sort of really not being protected under the series of laws and planning reforms that are being put forward. And one of the reasons why I wrote that article, and one of the reasons why I guess I wanted to come here today, was also, to talk about like the wider impact of a case like Westbury Printworks. That sparked, a conversation nationally, I think, and there was a big focus around, how cozy some relationships are, at a national level, and how, developers can still seem to buy influence. Those things are really, really important to actually understand. But I think, for me, it still goes back to the fact that, this application, for example, in my constituency, is still a live application. It still commits only to 21% affordable housing. And what does that mean, in terms of the interests of local people? It really, I think, shows that Northern and Shell, their tax haven using organization, it's a system. It's actually representative of a system that's not fit for purpose, and the lack of transparency and accountability in planning processes means that these cases, just like Westbury Printworks, are going to keep coming up again and again and again. And it's the deregulation of the housing sector that has led to this. So whilst, in my constituency, maybe, Westbury Printworks is still a live application and is going to be reviewed by a different minister to ensure that there isn't a conflict of interest, there are a number of things that I think should be happening in light of Westbury Printworks, and in light of the fact that, we need to start bringing up this conversation once again about the regulation of the housing sector. And I really think, the government should commit to publishing viability assessments in the future. That's one of the lessons, I think, that is learned from the Westbury Printworks debacle. Where affordable housing and site values are contested, and we need to make sure that there won't be opportunities where this is sort of left to companies to do themselves. So viability assessments should be tested, should be reviewed, and should be committed in terms of being published. And those are the kind of things that would really ensure that local people feel really empowered and involved. And I think as I was saying earlier, I think that's where some of the gaps, I think the gaps are really where there isn't local accountability, there isn't the local democracy, if you like, in terms of planning decisions that have a huge impact, not just on housing, but the actual sort of landscape of a particular area. And the other things that I would, I'm really keen to sort of campaign on and also see happen in the future is, look, we've got real big sort of ambitions in terms of what we would like to see in terms of social housing, and quite rightly so. What we want to see in terms of council house building. But I think we need to actually push further on some areas. I think we need rent controls, to protect private renters all of the time. No, not some of the time, but all of the time. I think we need to requisition empty homes by compulsory purchase orders. Those are the kind of things that should not be seen, I think, as radical, ideas. These should be, things that should be normal, because they ensure sort of basic accountability of the government's, targets and commitments, but also of individual landlords and individual property owners. And I would like to sort of see that happen as well. And so and I think the other area for me really is, and maybe this is partly because of the fact that I see and I feel that ethnic minority community voices are really disempowered in a constituency like mine, for example. I want to see how regulations on the housing sector, ensure that there is greater adequacy in terms of equality impact assessments as well, and for those to be published alongside, decisions on planning applications. Because I think, in a constituency like mine, where, the ethnic minority communities are so disproportionately impacted by availability of housing, that this should be something that is, so fundamental in terms of accountability as well. So I guess my big sort of message is really that, I'm really passionate about ensuring that voices of local people are heard, but not just, on one-off applications, but that our system needs to be challenged and be able to adopt measures which allow for those local voices to be heard and be inbuilt into the system. And some of these ways in which I've talked about, I think, can do that if they are inbuilt into the system. Of course, we're let down by the government and the Conservative Party, and their billionaire mates for far too long. But these are the kind of things I think should be really put forward to ensure that we can sort of build in democracy and build in accountability into the planning system. So I'm going to stop here because I would really like to obviously hear from yourselves and also take questions and maybe have a bit of discussion. I think there are a few of us, so it'd be really good to be able to have a discussion.
Thank you, Apsana. If anyone has a question or a comment, you can either put it in the chat and I'll pass it on, or you can raise your hand and speak directly. Okay, Jonathan?
Thank you, Comrade Apsana, for coming today. What role do you think that trades councils can play in regulating the housing sector, and what do you make of the idea of housing co-ops being a possible blueprint for housing in the future, and how do you think they should be implemented?
Thanks for that. And I think, I think trade union councils can really actually play a role. And I think partly it's to do with what accountability can be sort of garnered in terms of local decision-making processes. I mean, often one of the things that I get as an MP is lots of constituents writing to me talking about the fact that they all often get told by their politicians that, because there are quasi-judicial decisions being made around planning and housing, that there are various conflicts of interest and there are various reasons why a politician might not be able to influence decisions. And actually, like, okay, fine, that might be the case for like individual planning applications, but trade union council, for example, I think could play a role in trying to gather the people who have strong objections and to actually help organize activities around planning objections and what that actually looks like. Because what does organizing against a planning objection look like? Is it just petitions? Is it just organizing potential protests, or are there things that can be done to really look at what kind of grounds a planning application should be objected to, and what are the alternative models of planning that should be looked at? And I think trade union councils could actually play a role. But also, I think there are various I think parts of the housing sector that often are not talked about, and maybe this maybe I can relate to this a bit because having some experience of working in housing prior to being elected, is that there are also various shortages in terms of experts in the field, and people who the government desperately needs, people who have expertise in particular areas of housing planning and development. And there does seem to be a national shortage of people in some of these areas. But I think from a trade union perspective, I think is to actually look at some of those pressure points in the housing sector. The housing sector is changing quite a lot and is going to change quite a lot in the next 10 years. And I think right now in the pandemic and the challenges that it's brought. But I think actually looking at it also from an employment perspective would be quite interesting, because just to give you an example, I mean, if you look at the fact that we've got still a high rise number of buildings that are considered unsafe in terms of cladding and building safety. We have less than 300 people apparently in the country that are qualified to undertake surveys that can actually determine whether a building is safe or not safe, or to actually carry out the external wall cavity surveys, which is known as EWS1s. That to me points to a crisis of expertise in the housing sector. Now that might be me blowing it out of proportion, but I think there are different areas in the housing sector that need to be looked at. And I think from an employment perspective, I think that could also be looked at. I mean, I know, for example, from my constituency that there are housing associations, for example, that are trying to tender and trying to look for that expertise to try and address these fire safety and building safety issues. I think that's really concerning that there isn't that expertise. So what is happening in the housing sector to sort of encourage or build expertise in this area, when also I think there is an issue around the way in which employment in the housing sector is quite stretched. So I think that's potentially also an area which I think nationally, if quite a few of the trade union councils got together, it could actually also look at. So yeah, looking at it at a local level in terms of how we actually organise on planning objections and applications, but also nationally in terms of, you know, the various pressures on the housing sector as an employment system, if you like, is quite important. And on the second question, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see actually how housing co-ops could play an important role. And one of the things that I've been looking at recently is community land trusts and how that works in practice. And you know, we all know that we've got a severe homelessness crisis that is obviously, you know, was existing before the pandemic, but also now this whole winter period where, you know, the evictions ban has been lifted, and how there'll be, you know, rough sleepers out on the streets again. How can things work in terms of community land trust projects, but also sort of model housing? So, and I don't want to sort of concentrate on a London level, but just to look at, for example, where I am and looking at London level, there is a commitment, for example, from the GLA, which is to commit to certain amounts of modular housing in specific land areas. Now, I'm interested to see sort of how that would work in the long term, because, you know, some of the land that's been identified for this is not necessarily fit for purpose in terms of, you know, building high-rise buildings, for example, and there'd be a lot of work needed to be done to do that. But it's an interesting concept, and I can see how community land trusts in particular are working for well, we've secured one or two sites locally and we can see a community land trust project operating here locally. One of the things that I've anecdotally seen is how it's brought some communities together, and there's a bit more of, you know, sort of neighborhood engagement happening in those areas. But certainly I think as a model, I think it's something that could be explored in much more detail, and hasn't been. I doubt very much the government would be interested in it, but I'd like to see some of the commitments that have been made in the last Labour Party manifesto be kept and be built on. Absolutely.
Thanks. Well, I've got a question. You mentioned in your article about the campaigns in the Bangladesh community in the 70s and 80s, at a time now when we're sort of going to be looking at quite a sharp rise in evictions probably, and a lot of pressure from landlords on tenants, often in probably immigrant communities as well. But is there anything we can learn from those campaigns that might apply to the situation now, do you think?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think just on that, I mean, sometimes when I think about the local activism that happened, you know, the squatters movement and the anti-racism movement here locally in Tower Hamlets, some of the lessons that were learned was actually about how structurally things need to change in terms of our various systems. And it's so disappointing and so disheartening, obviously, to see like the Equalities Minister last Thursday talk about COVID and the impact on BAME communities, and completely deny that there is any sort of relation or connection to structural racism. So complete flat out denial. And to say that, you know, the experiences of somebody BAME who catches COVID and dies of COVID is, you know, the same as somebody who's not from that background is so disappointed. But I think also I think it was, now 40 years since one of the first reports, and Tom Murtha and others used to, you did some work on this, some of the early pioneers of actually looking at racism within the housing system. I think we need to review, we need to have a proper national review of that. And, the basic example that I've used some time and time again in Parliament, I think rings true. We're looking at, for example, COVID-19 and the pandemic, and we're looking at the fact that it's essentially a virus that is, attacks the respiratory systems, and we know that damp conditions, exist in those overcrowded households, and that the BAME communities are, disproportionately in those households, then they are more likely to, catch the virus. And, there's just an obvious direct link there, but is not still being made, I don't think, by the government. I think that some of those things need to be thought about. But also, I mean, it is really about, one of the things that I really do think about when it comes to that, the squatters movement and the fight for housing, was how actually it was at that point, and particularly sort of going into the 90s, it was locally for here, it was actually a Lib Dem council that was dividing communities. And, there were estates which were, BAME estates, and there were estates which were white-only estates. And that was as a result of deliberate decisions being made by Lib Dem council, for example, at the time. And it's not to say that, we as Labour are necessarily free of criticism in terms of our party policies on housing, but it is actually making sure that the fight is within, to fight to ensure that housing is fair and accessible for all is within our party as well. And so the fight is not just, and the battle is not just outside the party, it is very much to make sure that, the gains and the policies that we were able to develop in the last few years are retained and not drawn back on. Because, I think one of the biggest lessons of those times was the fact that political leadership and party political leadership at that time was, incredibly misguided. And, there was so much underpinning that in terms of, communities that were not seen to be, loyal to the state, or, that some of the really, terrible kind of stereotypes that we see being, communicated even the last week about people on benefits and things like that. It's those, really sort of, I hate to say classic, but it is, these classic sort of stereotypes of various communities and what that kind of gives rise to. So making sure that we are all kind of trying to do our best to influence and make sure that the party position that we do hold, and we have even in the last manifesto in 2019 as the Labour Party, is retained, is going to be quite key. And when we see attacks on it, we see, attacks in terms of, changing policies around how we, protect private renters against landlords, and we're seeing some of that kind of be shaken up. But I think, again, like, I think there has been a good level of resistance, I think, particularly from, organisations like Momentum and others, to try and put up a strong front on that, and to actually, talk about the fact that, we're not necessarily saying that, owning property is bad, although I think, we need to actually understand why we might be saying these things. But to talk about landlord rights over and above private renters' rights is absolutely wrong, and we know the reasons why, and making sure that we put up that strong struggle. We can't be, I mean, I'd be devastated to see, like, us, if we were in government, to be, to be pitting, private renters against landlords like that, and then taking the side of landlords, and believing that, that property and wealth and is something that the state should prioritize securing for people over, people who need access to stay safe and decent housing.
Thanks for that, Apsana. Is there anyone else who want to ask a question? Well, can I ask about? I mean, you've sort of touched on it there. There's a lot of focus on, certainly from a mental point of view, about the need for community organising, but that's something that obviously we need to do. But also we need to keep the pressure on the Labour Party, the party hierarchy, to maintain the progressive ideas of the previous leadership. And what I was going to ask is, how do we sort of find a balance there. How do we divide our energies between the two? If that makes sense.
So I suppose you're sort of saying, how do we kind of work within the party to try and maybe retain some of those policies? And I think, one of the things that I think we have to admit that how the pandemic has made it so much more harder to organize and forcing us to think about new ways of organizing. And I suspect that, if we had a, in-person party conference, I think there would have been a really strong presence of housing campaigners actually, and I think various announcements were just made just before the conference took place. So I think there were some opportunities that were missed, but that's that's just as a result of the way in which we currently operate. I think we do have to one of the strengths that I've seen is obviously around digital campaigning and how that kind of has put across some really strong messages across, especially onto the mainstream media around housing. I mean, how do we do that in a way which doesn't also, I think, alienate ourselves from within the party? I think is actually, to be honest with you, is actually just to be more bolder and braver with our stances, because I'll give you an example again. I mean, this is drawing back on my constituency, but the evictions resistance campaign from Momentum really actually gathered a lot of interest here locally, and also from communities that not necessarily feel kind of involved in political processes all the time. So I think that what that for me really showed was the fact that so I think sometimes we might feel the threat of like the higher levels of supposed authority within the Labour Party, and feel that maybe this is a shift that's happening at a much higher level that does not necessarily resonate with the membership, or may not have as much clout. And actually I think if anything, at the bare minimum, what is happening is that resistance, or the bold kind of campaigning at a grassroots level among the membership has meant that the any drawing back on policies and socialist gains, if you like, in our last manifesto has been slowed down. And that's definitely what I feel is happening as a result of some of the campaigns that are happening much more widely, much more broadly. And I really do think that it's good being having an insight as to what is happening in Parliament, and rightly you should even hold a Labour politician like me to account on this. But I also think that the real threat in terms of gains that can be made through government policies actually happening out there in the country. And I don't know, just looking at even the last week, I don't know Marcus Rashford's politics. I don't know where he sits, whether he's a Labour Party supporter, whether he's right or left or anything like that. But here's somebody who's used his platform, and I've always been a bit skeptical about celebrity endorsements and things like that, but I don't think this is quite the same thing really. It's not celebrity coming and launching a campaign that's being run by somebody else. This is somebody who's actually talking about lived experience, giving actual like fact-based evidence, and is making connections that previously haven't necessarily been made on policy. And now it's started a national conversation, and having a discussion on a policy which doesn't actually is going further than just sort of saying, can you feed children over the half-term holidays, but is actually talking about the right to food, and that this is not, this has started to actually change the way in which we talk about our fundamental essentials, is I think showing what can be achieved through a movement outside of Westminster, outside of Parliament actually. And I feel sort of have like renewed energy and renewed hope about what can actually be achieved through campaigns like that. And it does require consistency. It does require sort of not giving up because there are maybe certain voices within our party and beyond that feel that they've got the upper hand. But I think I can't say I can underestimate the impact that even a voice like that and the national campaign behind it is having actually in the corridors of Westminster. It's actually having an impact. Slightly different, I guess, from the topic of housing, but it's just to show kind of, I guess, in what way I think our energies are rightly so should be focused in a lot of ways outside of what's happening in Parliament, because sometimes what happens is that actually has an impact on what is happening in there.
Yeah, I certainly think there's been a lot of interesting conversations on social media around Marcus Ratchford's campaign. Unfortunately, he plays for the wrong club, but that's another matter. Does anyone else have any questions? James, can you unmute yourself, James?
Hello, Apsana. It seems to me a big thing we need to do is actually challenge the idea that everyone needs to own private property and make private renting and social housing fashionable again. I think if we're honest, and Thatcher was successful in a whole scheme about selling off council homes and putting the whole idea of home ownership as something that you had to do in life, and that if you don't own your own home, you've somehow failed in life. And it seems to me that we have to somehow challenge that whole idea. Otherwise, we're going to struggle.
I think you're right, and I think the right to a decent and safe home, or the right to to own your home, I think is key there, isn't it? And you're right, but I do think that I do think culturally we're maybe not there yet. But I think keeping up that discussion and keeping up those points is really, really important, particularly when you have experiences of people who we need to make those links, I think, in terms of the lack of available housing because of the fact that so many of those homes have been sold off, and then only then might become available for private rent, and and then it becomes really poor standards of homes that are available for rent, and these issues around rogue landlords. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think we do need to have that shift in our discussions. I think the right to buy policy, even in the last few years, has obviously seen so many properties and so much home ownership kind of result in sort of further decline. And I look at housing associations now, for example. I used to work for one, and they are now sort of leasehold management organizations, and I sit on an APPG, which is around leasehold reform, and I don't want to have to, have some of my energies focused on that, because I think in a lot of ways, strange, and this might be hard to believe, but also leaseholders do get a bad deal because even they can't hold developers to account. They can't hold organizations that have built the buildings that they ended up buying to account. And although that they for me are maybe not they have my sympathies, but they don't have maybe as much sympathy as the person who's out on the street or is not able to even get a social home. What it demonstrates is actually the significant problems around accountability. The way that the system is designed means that even developers, even the government, who is so cozy and so sort of favorable to these developers, means that even the leasehold system is very messy and needs so much reform. And I suspect, and maybe this is me being a cynic, I suspect any of the leasehold reform that comes through government and in Parliament in the next couple of years, because I'm sure service charge reform and common home reform is going to be high up on the agenda for the next 2 years, because that's sort of seen as appealing to a traditional supporter base for the Conservatives, is not going to still amount to much reform at all, and it's certainly not going to close the loopholes in terms of developers and how they're able to build and get away with building really poor quality buildings overall. But I completely understand and appreciate what you're saying. I do think the debate needs to be really around not showing and having the having home ownership as an aspiration, and as a measure of success. And look at the pressure that he puts people under, like this 5% deposit scheme now, that they've announced to get the housing market up and running, knowing that people are not going to really be buying or selling at the moment. But again, this reinforcing this idea that it's possible, and we're making it possible for you to do that, and it's your own individual failure for you not being able to own a property.
Thank you. I think we're drawing to a close now. So if are there any more? Is there one more final question, or if anybody? I think we'll finish
Julie,
there.
I think.
Oh, Julie, sorry.
So no, it's just a comment. I just want to thank you, Apsana, for coming today. It's just thinking about housing, education, health. These are our fundamental human rights, and we need to protect them always. So it feels like our rights are being chipped away, and I think housing is one of them. So we need to make sure that we are on the ground campaigning and getting involved as much as possible. So I just want to say thank you, Apsana, for
You're very welcome, and I couldn't agree with you more. And the housing system often feels so complex and so hard to navigate. And I've been enthused by the work of the renters unions, seeing the work by Acorn, and to really help people in even with their specific individual cases. These some of the template letters that I've seen that are helping people kind of take their landlord or their their housing associations and so forth and holding them to account has been quite good to see. So I think some of that work is happening. It's unfortunate, it almost feels like you have to almost go on a course to actually understand your own sort of housing situation, but to see that work being done, and that the training schools and the various ways in which those unions are supporting people is I think quite heartening as well, to navigate what is actually obviously a very complex system.
Yeah, I mean, Acorn are doing some fantastic work, I know, in Manchester, on individual cases, collectively. A lot of groups of people getting involved in individual cases, and that's a way of sharing expertise and helping in particular cases. And that might be a model for things that we do going forward. So on that note, I think we'll finish it there. Thank you very much, Apsana Begum, for coming to us today. Thanks for everyone for attending and asking you questions. This will be recorded, so if you want to watch it again, I'll post a link in the Slack. But in the meantime, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Lovely to see everyone. Thank you.
Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.